Good day, everyone. My name is Angela Luis, and I'm here to discuss Chapter 8, The Nervous System. The functions of the nervous system. Here are following functions of our nervous system. The first one is receiving sensory input, in which our sensory receptors monitor numerous external and internal stimuli. We are aware of sensation from stimuli such as vision, hearing, taste, smell, touch, pain, body position, and temperature. Other stimuli such as blood pH, blood gases, and blood pressure are processed at the subconscious level. The second one is integrating information. The brain and the spinal cord are the major organs for processing sensory input and initiating responses. The input may produce an immediate response or be restored as a memory or be ignored. On the third one, controlling muscles and glands, our skeletal muscles normally contract only when stimulated by the nervous system. Thus, by controlling skeletal muscles, the nervous system controls the major movement of the body. The nervous system also participates in controlling cardiac muscles, smooth muscles, and many glands. Fourth one is maintaining homeostasis. The nervous system plays an important role in maintaining homeostasis. This function depends on the nervous system's ability to detect, interpret, and respond to changes in internal and external conditions. In response, the nervous system can stimulate or inhibit the activities of other systems to help maintain a constant interval environment. Last but not the least is establishing and maintaining mental activity. So the brain is the center of our mental activity, including consciousness, memory, and thinking. Now let's continue to the divisions of the nervous system. The central nervous system or CNS consists of the brain and the spinal cord, whereas the peripheral nervous system or PNS consists of all the nervous tissues outside the CNS. The sensory division of the PNS transmits action potentials to the CNS, and the motor division carries away action potential away from the CNS. The motor division is divided into somatic and autonomic systems. The somatic nervous system innervates skeletal muscles and is mostly under voluntary control, whereas the autonomic nervous system innervates cardiac muscles, smooth muscles, and glands and is mostly under involuntary control. The autonomic nervous system is divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, and the indric nervous system contains both sensory and motor neurons, which can function independently of the central nervous system. This illustration shows the division of the nervous system, which consists of our central nervous system or CNS and the peripheral nervous system or the PNS. Now let's talk about the cells of our nervous system. The first one is the neurons. Neurons receive stimuli and conduct action potentials. A neuron consists of a cell body, dendrites, and an axon. Neurons can either be multipolar, bipolar, or pseudo-unipolar. Here you can see an illustration of the different types of neuron. First one being a multipolar neuron that has many dendrites and an axon. Second one is a bipolar neuron that has a dendrite and an axon. And the last one is the pseudo-unipolar neuron that appears to have an axon and no dendrites. Another cell of our nervous system is the glial cells. They are the preliminary supportive cells of the CNS and PNS, meaning these cells do not conduct action potentials. Neuroglia is far more numerous than neurons. Most neuroglia retains the ability to divide, whereas neurons do not. Here are the 5 types of glial cells. The first one is the astrocytes, serves as major supporting cells in the CNS. In this role, astrocytes can stimulate or inhibit the signaling activity of nearby neurons. Astrocytes also help limit damage to neural tissues. However, the repair process can form a scar that blocks regeneration of damaged axons. The second type of glial cells is the epidermal cells, which lines the fluid-filled cavities within the CNS. Some epidermal cells produce cerebrospinal fluid and others with cilia on the surface to help move the cerebrospinal fluid throughout the CNS. The third one is the microglia. This acts as an immune cells of the CNS. They help protect the brain by removing bacteria and cell debris. Last but not the least is the oligodendrocytes. In the CNS and Schwann cells in the PNS provide an insulating material that surrounds the axon. Next one is the myelin sheaths. Myelin sheaths are specialized layers that wrap around the axons of some neurons. Axons are either unmyelinated or myelinated. In here, you can see a comparison of myelinated and unmyelinated axon. So myelinated axon with two Schwann cells forming part of the myelin sheaths around a single axon, while unmyelinated axons with two Schwann cells surrounding several axons in parallel formation. Now let's proceed to the organization of the nervous tissues. So both the CNS and the PNS contains areas of gray matter and areas of white matter. Gray matter consists of groups of neuron cell bodies and their dendrites, where there is a very little myelin. And white matter consists of bundles of parallel axons with their myelin sheaths, which are whitish in color. Now let's talk about the electrical signals in the neural pathways. Resting membrane potential. A resting membrane potential results from the charge of differences across the membranes of cells. The resting membrane potential is set by leak ion channel and the sodium-potassium pump. In here, you can see an illustration of the voltage-gated ion channels in the action potential, in which the first illustration shows the status of the voltage-gated sodium and potassium channels in a resting cell, and the next shows the channels open and close to produce an action potential. Last step is that the graph shows in red the membrane potential resulting from a condition of the ion channels. Now let's proceed to the action potential. An action potential occurs when the charge across the cell membrane is briefly reversed. Chemically gated and voltage-gated ion channels generate the action potential. This illustration shows that once a local potential reaches the threshold or all or non-action potential is started, during the depolarization phase, the voltage across the cell membrane changes from approximately negative 70 MV to approximately positive 20 MV. During the repolarization phase, the voltage across the cell membrane returns to negative 70 MV. There is a brief period of hyperpolarization at the end of repolarization before the membrane returns to its resting membrane potential. The entire process lasts for 1 or 2 milliseconds. Now let's talk about the synapse. A synapse is a point of contact between two neurons or between a neuron and another cell, such as a muscle or gland cell. An action potential arriving the synapse causes the release of a neurotransmitter from the presynaptic terminal, which diffuses across the synaptic cliff and binds the receptor of the postsynaptic membrane. So a synapse consists of the end of a neuron, which is called the presynaptic terminal, and the small space is called the synaptic cliff, and the postsynaptic membrane of another neuron or an effector cell, such as muscle or gland cell. The next thing we're going to talk about is the reflexes. So a reflex is an involuntary reaction in response to a stimulus applied to a periphery and transmitted to the CNS. Reflexes allow a person to react to stimuli more quickly than it is possible if conscious thought is involved. A complex reflex arc consists of a sensory receptor, a sensory neuron, interneurons, a motor neuron, and an effector organ. The simplest reflex arcs do not involve interneurons. In this illustration, you can see the parts of a reflex arc, which are labeled in order in which action potential passes through them. The 5 components are the following. Number 1 is the sensory receptor. 2 is the sensory neuron. 3 is the interneuron. 4 is motor neuron. And 5 is the effector organ. Simple reflex arcs have only 4 components because of the reflex does not involve interneurons. The neural pathways. Neurons are organized within the CNS to form pathways ranging from relatively simple to extremely complex. The 2 simplest pathways are converging and diverging pathways. Converging pathways, two or more neurons synapse with the same neuron. This allows information to be transmitted in more than one neural pathway to converge into a simple pathway. Whereas diverging pathway, the axon from the one neuron divides the synapses with more than one other neuron. This allows the information to be transmitted in one neural pathway to diverge into two or more pathways. In this illustration, you can see the converging and diverging pathways of the nervous system. The first one shows a general model of a converging pathways which shows two neurons converging onto one neuron. And the second picture shows the general model of a diverging pathway, since it shows that one neuron is diverging into two neurons. The next thing that we're gonna talk about is the central and peripheral nervous system. As mentioned previously, the central nervous system or the CNS consists of the brain and spinal cord, whereas the peripheral nervous system or PNS consists of all the nerves and ganglia outside the brain and spinal cord. Motor neurons in the PNS relay information from CNS to muscles and glands in various parts of the body, regulating activity in those structures. Spinal cord. The spinal cord extends from foramen magnum to the second lumbar vertebra. Below that is the cauda equina. Spinal cord has gray central part organized into horns and peripheral white part forming nerve tracts. The roots of the spinal cord nerves extend out of the cord. In here, you can see that in each segment of the spinal cord, rootlets combine to form a dorsal root or on the dorsal, posterior side, and the ventral root on the ventral or anterior side. Second picture shows the relationship of sensory and motor neurons to the spinal cord. Now let's talk about the spinal cord reflexes. First one is the knee-jerk reflex, which occurs when the quadriceps femoris muscle is stretched. On to the right, you can see how the knee-jerk reflex occurs. The next spinal cord reflexes is a withdrawal reflex, which removes a body part from a painful stimulus. On to your right, you can see an illustration of a withdrawal reflex. Spinal nerves. So the spinal nerves exit the vertebral column at the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral regions. The nerves are grouped into plexus. The phrenic nerve, which supplies the diaphragm, is the most important branch of the cervical plexus, and the branchial plexus supplies nerves to the upper limb. And the lumbosacral plexus supplies the nerves to the lower limb. In this illustration, you can see the plexus and the dermatomal map. And in here, you can see a table of the plexus of the spinal nerves, which shows the plexus, its origin, major nerves, muscles innervated, and skin innervated. Now, let's talk about the brain and its different parts and functions. The brainstem. The brainstem connects the spinal cord to the remainder of the brain. The brainstem contains several nuclei. The medulla oblongata contains nuclei that controls activities such as heart rate, breathing, swallowing, and balance. The pons contain relay nuclei between the cerebrum and cerebellum. The midbrain is involved in hearing and in visual reflexes, and the reticular formation is scattered throughout the brainstem and is important in regulating skeletal motor functions, and it involves in maintaining consciousness and sleep-wake cycle. Now let's proceed to the cerebellum, diencephalon, and cerebrum. So the cerebellum is attached to the brainstem, and the diencephalon consists of the thalamus, which is the main sensory relay center, the epithalamus, which is the pineal gland and may play a role in sexual maturation, and the hypothalamus is important in maintaining homeostasis. In cerebrum, the cerebrum has two hemispheres, which are divided into lobes: the frontal lobe, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes. Here you can see an illustration of the brainstem and the diencephalon. Sensory functions. So the CNN constantly receives sensory input, and we are unaware of much of the input, but it is vital to our survival. Some sensory inputs results in sensation. Input to the cerebrum and cerebellum keep us informed about our environment and allows the CNS to control motor functions. A small portion of a sensory input results in perception, the consciousness awareness of stimuli. Ascending tracts. Here you can see that ascending tract transmits action potentials from the periphery to the brain. Each tract carries a specific type of sensory information. This shows a table of the ascending tracts, its pathway, and functions. Sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. In here, you can see an illustration that shows the sensory and motor areas of the lateral side of the left cerebral cortex, where ascending tracts project the primary sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. Association areas are involved in recognizing the sensory input. Ascending tracts project to specific regions of the cerebral cortex, called primary sensory areas, where sensations are perceived. The primary somatic sensory cortex or general sensory area is located in the parietal lobe, posterior to the central sulcus. Sensory fibers carrying general sensory inputs such as pain, pressure, and temperature, synapses in the thalamus, and thalamatic neurons relay in the information to the primary somatic sensory cortex. Sensory fibers from specific parts of the body project to specific regions of the primary somatic sensory cortex, so that a topographic map of the body with the head most inferior exits the part of the cerebral cortex. Now, let's talk about the motor functions. Motor functions include involuntary and voluntary movements. Upper motor neurons in the cerebral cortex connect to lower motor neurons in the spinal cord or cranial nerve nuclei. Upper motor neurons have cell bodies in the cerebral cortex. The axon of upper motor neurons form descending tracts that connects to lower motor neurons, and lower motor neurons have cell bodies in the anterior horn of the spinal cord gray matter or in cranial nerve nuclei. Their axons leave the central nervous systems and extend throughout the spinal or cranial nerves to skeletal muscles. Motor areas of the cerebral cortex. The upper motor neurons are located in the primary motor cortex, and the premotor and the prefrontal areas regulate movements. The premotor area of the frontal lobe is where the motor functions are organized before they're actually initiated in the primary motor cortex. For example, if a person decided to take a step, the neurons of the premotor area are first stimulated, and the determination is made up there as to which muscles must contract, in what order and what degree. Action potentials are then passed through the upper motor neurons of the primary motor cortex, which initiate each planned movement. In the prefrontal area, this association cortex is well developed in only primates, especially us humans. It is involved in our motivation and regulation of emotional behavior and mood. The large size of these areas in humans may account for our emotional complexity and our relatively well-developed capacity to think ahead and feel motivated. Descending tracts. Descending tracts project directly from upper motor neurons in the cerebral cortex to lower motor neurons in the spinal cord and brainstem. Indirectly, they project from the basal nuclei and the cerebellum of the cerebral cortex through the brainstem and the lower motor neurons in the spinal cord. In here, you can see a table of the descending tract which shows the pathways and its functions. The basal nuclei. Basal nuclei help plan, organize, and coordinate motor movements and posture. People with basal nucleal disorder exhibits increased muscle tone and exaggerated uncontrolled movement when at rest. On to your left, you can see an illustration of the basal nuclei. Cerebellum. The cerebellum is involved in balance, muscle tone, and muscle coordination. Through its comparator function, the cerebellum compares the intended action to what is occurring and modifies the action to eliminate differences. If the cerebellum is damaged, muscle tone decreases and fine motor movement become very clumsy. And to your left, you can see an illustration of the cerebellum. Other brain functions. Communication between the right and left hemisphere. Each hemisphere controls the opposite half of the body. Commissures connect the two hemispheres, and the left hemisphere is thought to be the dominant analytical hemisphere, and the right hemisphere is thought to be the dominant for spatial perception and musical ability. Speech. Speech involves the sensory speech area, the motor speech area, and the interaction between them and other cortical areas. In most people, the speech area is on the left side of the cerebral cortex. Two major cortical areas are involved in speech. The sensory speech are located in the parietal lobe functions in understanding and formulating coherent speech, and the motor speech area is located in the frontal lobe, which controls the movement of necessary for speech. Damage to these parts of the brain or associated brain regions may result in aphasia, absence or defective speech or language comprehension. The next thing we're gonna talk about is the brainwave and consciousness. An electroencephalogram or EEG monitors brainwaves, which are a summation of electrical activity of the brain. EEG patterns can be detected as wave-like pattern known as brainwaves. Their intensity and frequency differ based on the state of brain activity. The different level of consciousness is an awake and a sleeping person are marked by different types of brainwaves, such as the alpha waves, beta waves, delta waves, and theta waves. Alpha waves are observed in normal person who is awake but in a quiet or resting state with the eyes closed. Beta waves have higher frequency than alpha waves and occur during intense mental activity or during the beginning of sleep. Delta waves occur during sleeping in infants and in patients with severe brain disorders, and theta waves are usually observed in children, but they can also occur in adults who are experiencing frustration or have certain brain disorders. And here you can see an illustration of the electroencephalogram or EEG on the left side, and here on the right side, you can see the different patterns that doctor used to diagnose and determine the treatment for the disorders. Now let's proceed to the memory. The types of memories are working means lasting a few seconds to minutes, short term which lasts for a few minutes, and long term or permanent memory. Long-term memory includes declarative and procedural memories. The limbic system and emotion. The limbic system includes the olfactory cortex, deep cortical regions, and nuclei. The limbic system is involved with memory, motivation, mood, and other visceral functions. Olfactory stimulation is a major influence. And onto your left side, you can see an illustration of the limbic system. Now let's proceed to the meninges, ventricle, and cerebrospinal fluid. First one is the meninges. Three connective tissues meninges covers the CNS, the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. The dura mater surround and protect the brain and spinal cord, and it is the most superficial and thickest of the meninges. The arachnoid mater is the second meningeal membrane, and it is very thin and wispy. Lastly, the pia mater is very tightly bound to the surface of the brain and spinal cord. Here you can see an interior superior view of the head to show the meninges, meningeal membrane surrounding the spinal cord, and the cross-section of the vertebra and the spinal cord. The next one is the ventricles. The brain and spinal cord contain fluid-filled cavities, the lateral ventricles in the cerebral hemisphere, a third ventricle in the diencephalon, and a cerebral aqueduct in the midbrain, a fourth ventricle at the base of the cerebellum, and a central canal in the spinal cord. The fourth ventricle has openings in the subarachnoid space. Here you can see an illustration and parts of the ventricles. The cerebrospinal fluid or CSF bathes the brain and spinal cord, providing a protective cushion around the CNS. It is formed in the choroid plexus in the ventricles. It exits through the fourth ventricle and re-enters the blood through the arachnoid granulations in the superior sagittal sinus. Now let's proceed to the cranial nerves. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves and 3 with only sensory functions, 4 with somatic motor functions, 1 with somatic motor and sensory functions, 1 with somatic motor and parasympathetic function, and 3 with all 3 functions, and 4 of the cranial nerves have parasympathetic function. The sensory and motor functions of many cranial nerves cross from one side of the head or body to the opposite side of the cerebral cortex. In here, you can see a table of the cranial nerve and their different functions. The autonomic nervous system, or ANS, have autonomic neurons that innervate smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, and glands. Autonomic functions are largely controlled unconsciously. The autonomic nervous system contains preganglionic and postganglionic neurons. The autonomic nervous system has sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. Sympathetic neurons generally prepares the individual for physical activity, whereas parasympathetic stimulation generally activates involuntary functions such as digestion that are normally associated with body at rest. Anatomy of the sympathetic division. Preganglionic cell bodies of the sympathetic division lie in the thoracic and upper lumbar regions of the spinal cord. Postganglionic cell bodies are located in the sympathetic chain ganglia or the collateral ganglia. And the anatomy of the parasympathetic division is that the preganglionic cell bodies of the parasympathetic division are associated with some of the cranial and sacral nerves. And postganglionic cell bodies are located in the terminal ganglia either near or within target organs. Here you can see a table of the sympathetic and parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Now let's proceed to the autonomic neurotransmitters. All autonomic preganglionic and parasympathetic postganglionic neurons secretes acetylcholine. Most sympathetic postganglionic neurons secretes norepinephrine. Many body function can be stimulated or inhibited by drugs that neither mimic these neurotransmitters or prevent the neurotransmitters from activating their target tissues. Functions of the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic division prepares a person for action by increasing heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, and release of glucose for energy. The parasympathetic division is involved in involuntary activities at rest, such as digestion of food, defecation, and urination. The last part of the nervous system is the enteric nervous system. The enteric nervous system forms plexus in the digestive tract wall. Enteric neurons are sensory motor or interneurons that they receive CNS input but can also function independently. Although the ENS is capable of controlling the activities of the digestive tract completely and independently of the CNS, normally the two systems work together. CNS controls the parasympathetic branches of the vagus nerve and the sympathetic nerves, can override the actions of the enteric neurons. Hence, the enteric nervous system is independent subdivision of the PNS that is integrated with the ANS. The effects of aging on the nervous system. In general, sensory and motor functions decline with age because of the decrease of number of sensory neurons. Mental function including memory may decline with age, but this varies from person to person. A decrease of sense of position of the limbs and on the joints can affect balance and coordination. Information about the position, tension, and length of tendons and muscles also decreases further, reducing the sense of movement, posture, and position, as well as the control and coordination of movements. Other sensory neurons will reduce function, including those that monitor blood pressure, thirst, objects in the throat, that amount of urine in the urinary bladder, and the amount of feces in the rectum. As a result, elderly people are more prone to high blood pressure, dehydration, swallowing and choking problems, urinary incompetence, and constipation or bowel incontinence. Reflexes slow as people age because both the generation and the condition of action potentials and sympathetic functions are slow. The number of neurotransmitter and receptors decline. Many of these changes are affected by a person's background, education, health, motivation, and experience. Here you can see a table of the list of diseases and disorders in the nervous system. It appears that continued mental activity can decrease the loss of mental skills with aging. And that's the end of my discussion about the nervous system. Thank you for listening and have a nice day.